Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Concord Museum and our second annual Earth Day Forum. We'll talk about the history of Earth Day later this evening, but it falls on April 22nd, just 3 days after April 19th, and it's always seemed to me that just as the local militia and Minutemen fired the shot heard around the world that led to our nation's independence, that in the spirit of the legacy of Henry David Thoreau, Concord should be on the forefront of leading the effort to declare our independence from fossil fuels and other drivers of climate change. We inaugurated this series with a conversation with Richard Premark, a biologist from Boston University who uses data from Thoreau's journals of certain seasonal occurrences, the blooming of flowers, ice melts at Walden Pond, and compares those with the dates of those same natural developments when they occur today to give us a better understanding of the effects of global warming. And speaking with Richard that night, that was a couple of years ago, was Barbara Moran, who, like our guest this evening, is a journalist who covers climate, though in Barbara's case, she does it for WBUR, Boston's NPR news station. So we're so pleased to have Tatiana Schlossberg here with us this evening. She's currently a freelance journalist writing about climate change and the environment, having previously reported on those subjects for the science and climate sections of the New York Times. I thought rather than providing a more fulsome introduction, I'd use these first few minutes, Tatiana, just to ask you a couple of questions that would give our viewers a better sense of your background and how you came to this work. So I know you went to high school in your home city of New York and you studied at Yale and Oxford, but I believe your focus there was more on history. So I'm interested in learning what drew you to first to science kind of writ large, and then second to dedicating this most recent portion of your life and career to writing about climate change.
Well, thank you so much, Tom, for having me, and to everyone who's watching. I'm always just amazed that people I don't know want to listen to me talk. So thank you for joining. I did study history both in college and graduate school. And I think that, I had always been interested in the environment. I was in high school when An Inconvenient Truth came out. And so that was, I think, formative for a lot of people my age. But I really became interested in kind of understanding climate change and environmental degradation as a sort of historical phenomenon, reading sort of works of environmental history in graduate school. So I read a book, two books that were really important to me. One is Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin, which is a kind of natural history in a way of Chicago, and just a way of thinking about cities and their relationship to the places in which they're located that I hadn't encountered before. And the other one is called The Mortal Sea, Fishing the Atlantic in the Age of Sail, which kind of looks at the North Atlantic, which is, I assume, something that most of the people watching are familiar with, and sort of taking the long view of how people have related to the kind of amazing abundance of the natural resource of the North Atlantic Ocean. One theory that kind of came to the fore in reading that book is this idea of shifting baselines, which is that people take the natural world when they're born as kind of the natural condition of how things have been. And seeing that, I've seen in my lifetime, even the way that things have changed in Martha's Vineyard, where I've been able to spend summers, and how things have changed there over time. And so it was shocking, although it shouldn't have been, to sort of put that in this historical context. And then I was working at the New York Times as a reporter on the Metro desk. And I had also worked at a paper in New Jersey during Hurricane Sandy, and sort of seen how the climate crisis confronted people in sort of their everyday lives, and kind of picking up on the idea that this is the biggest story in the world. And so from a journalistic perspective, it's nothing but interesting. It's a story about everything. It's about people and culture and history and food and fashion and health and politics and international relations and justice and refugees and everything. And so it felt like I would be crazy not to want to write about it.
Right. So some ways it's a little overwhelming of a topic to write about every evening.
Yeah.
But you do a really wonderful job. And so the book is Inconspicuous Consumption, the Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have. Congratulations, it won the 2020 Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award. And it's gotten wonderful reviews. I thought I might just read a little bit from Bill McKibben's review in the New York Times. He commends you for having researched every scary and fascinating statistic on the subject, but says that time was well spent. One comes away from this book with a stronger sense of the sheer largeness of the human enterprise, the number of us now consuming, and the overwhelming effect of that volume on the planet. And finally, he concludes, you deserve credit for coming through this journey into the guts of the consumer machine with a clarifying insight. We aren't going to solve our problems one consumer at a time. We're going to need it as societies and civilizations are not at all. So first, it's a wonderful title. I wonder how you came up with it, and especially the first, Inconspicuous Consumption is clever. And then the environmental impact you don't know you have. Maybe you can kind of give our viewers a sense of what your main thesis is in the book.
Yeah, so I wanted to, the book is sort of about the environmental and climate impacts of a lot of our stuff in 4 different areas. So the internet and technology, food, fashion, and fuel. And it's the obvious play is on conspicuous consumption. And these are sort of the impacts that that we don't think about, whether it's, how cheap cashmere relates to the desertification of Mongolia and parts of China, or the impact of streaming Netflix on coal use in Virginia. These are sort of the consequences of our consumption and our daily habits that are obscured from us, but that we also willfully ignore. The environmental impact you didn't know you had, a lot of the stuff is really hard to find out, and often kind of deliberately so. I think, as consumers, of course, we're not often presented with the information to understand what the impacts of our stuff is. And there are people who do know those things, and they're the people who work at the companies or run the companies that make all of our stuff. And so I wanted to place the emphasis, as the review so accurately says, on that this is not, that I don't think that climate change is something that we should feel guilty about as individuals, but rather something that we should feel collectively responsible for fixing. And that's because we've placed so much of the responsibility for the crisis kind of on the individual, when we usually don't kind of have the power to make it the sustainable choice. And companies actually really do, as do politicians, or can help us to do that. And so that was sort of the thesis of the book, is that as consumers, we have to understand how all of these systems work in order to demand that they be changed. I don't think you can fix a problem if you don't understand it, but ultimately that this requires that kind of collective action, which manifests itself through voting or civic action, or the ways that we relate to the companies that supply us our goods, rather than me not bringing my plastic bag to the, or me bringing a reusable bag to the grocery store or whatever it is.
So I should tell the viewers that Tatiana and I agree that we're going to try to have this be as hopeful a message, and we want to empower people this evening on the eve of Earth Day. And so talk a little bit, because it really is one of the main conclusions of your book, is I was thinking you write about the environmental impact you don't know you have, but you're also trying to remind people of the political impact that we sometimes feel we don't have. And it's related to the history of Earth Day, but you write about an important election that happened in 1970 that people sometimes forget about, but maybe you can tell the story.
Yeah, sure. So I think, one of the most important, people often ask me what are the things I can do to have the biggest, reduce my carbon footprint or something. And the most important thing that you can do is to vote. And not only to vote, but to participate in the civic process. And, I think that can feel challenging, especially, I wrote the book in 2017 and 2018. And but I think, we can see that change is possible in elections. And I think part of the reason that that I look to the first Earth Day in 1970 as an example is because it does provide a model of that. So in that year, organizers from Environmental Action, which was a environmental advocacy activist group, organized around the 12 members of Congress with the worst environmental records, who they called the Dirty Dozen. And 7 of the 12 were defeated in the 1970 election. And that really changed Congress and helped bring us some of the most important environmental legislation that we often take for granted today. It's hard to imagine, the expansion of the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the National Environmental Policy Act without that 1970 Congress and the creation of the EPA in 1970. So I think it's important to remember that it is possible to make a difference. And we can look to that example of 1970 in the same, for that. I think in the same way, we can look at the 2018 midterms at many of the members of Congress who were elected then. I think, especially Representative Ocasio-Cortez, along with Ed Markey, who introduced the Green New Deal. They have changed the conversation about what is possible, what can the government do to address climate change, and really, I think, moved the conversation from the idea that it's only about energy to really that it is about a societal transformation that needs to encompass just transition and issues around social and racial justice and equality. And I think we have a completely different conversation now than we did 5 years ago. And that's a huge testament to their leadership, but also to all of the people who, elected them and elected the other members of Congress who have helped them in achieving that.
I want to restate a point that you made just a minute earlier, because it really is one of your central lessons or theses, which is that we shouldn't feel individually guilty about the behaviors or our role in these global systems that are degrading the environment, but collectively responsible. And you write that sometimes by taking it all on ourselves, we actually let off the hook those who you feel are responsible. So talk a little bit more. You mentioned it briefly, but a little bit more about who you feel is responsible and how we as ordinary citizens can hold those individuals or those entities more responsible for doing the right thing.
Yeah, I think, this, the conversation around fixing climate change, solving climate change has turned on the individual behavior and really made us feel guilty about our habits. And I think that narrative of personal responsibility has been destructive because it has let those who are actually responsible, as Tom suggests, who are fossil fuel companies, their lobbyists, and the politicians who have taken money from them, off the hook for the crisis that they have created. And I think, it also suggests that this is an easy problem to solve, that it can be solved by changing your light bulb and bringing your reusable bag to the grocery store. And those things are important and they're good to do, but that's not the scale of the change that we need. And so I think, I believe Senator Warren said in one of the presidential debates that the fossil fuel companies want you to be talking about your plastic straw because that's a distraction from the millions of gallons of barrels of oil that are being burned every day. So and we can see that in the lawsuits like Exxon New and all these other climate change related lawsuits against fossil fuel companies, that they do bear a degree of responsibility. And it's that doesn't let us off the hook either, because now that we know this information about all of the destructive impacts of fossil fuels and all of our stuff, we have to do something about it. But I think it can help us sort of focus our energy and our attention towards the actual polluters who really, are driving this and making it worse every day.
I was struck, I'm not sure why, I may quote a famous Democratic president at the end of this, but I was actually in reading your call to educate citizenry. reminded of President Eisenhower's famous farewell address, where he was addressing the military industrial complex and warning the country about it. I just wanted to quote from it. He says, "Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together." And it seems to me your message is that only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of our global economic system, so that our planet and those who inhabit it can prosper together. And it's a very edifying book, and I want to kind of now go through some of the chapters and some of the points, but I'll remind everyone that if you use the chat feature to send a comment or a question, which we will turn to towards the end of our conversation, and Tatiana will answer. And then at the end, we'll randomly pick the name of one of you who submits a question and send you a copy of Tatiana's book. So let's start, Tatiana, as you do, on the internet. And I think your main point here is that it's one of those areas that we somewhat take for granted, and we don't have a sense of the environmental impact that our use of the internet has. So maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, sure. I think for so many of us, first of all, I think we've kind of been sold the narrative, which is rapidly crumbling, that technology will save us. But also, that it saves paper and it's whatever it is, that all this stuff is electronic. But I think because for so many of us, we can sort of use the internet without understanding necessarily how it works. A lot of the ways in which it consumes energy and resources is kind of hidden or not immediately apparent. And so one of the, and of course, I think, more and more people are aware of this with things like cryptocurrency and NFTs that have been in the news a lot lately, which I wrote about in my book. So I'm feeling rather prescient, but yeah, the internet is on all the time. That's how we can, shop on Amazon in our sleep. And it's because there are servers and routers on, all over the world that are sending and receiving information. And, it's not to overstate the amount of energy that the internet uses. It's about, I think, 2 to 3% of global electricity use and responsible for about 1 to 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's small compared to a lot of things, but I think it's bigger than most people realize. And, it's only getting more energy intensive with more video. One amazing statistic that I remember from the book is I looked at a study that came out, I think in 2015, that was examining, based on data from 2009, how much electricity or how much video, or whether it was more efficient to stream a video online or to rent a DVD or buy a DVD from a store. And that year, we watched something like 3.2 billion hours of video. And in 2018, we watched 114 billion hours of video. So the energy demands of the internet have increased so dramatically. And yes, things get more efficient, but we are, in many ways kind of, it's what scientists call the Jevons paradox. We are sort of out consuming the energy savings that we have made. And, given the way that, I think for something that's really interesting for me to learn was, or just to think more about was, the internet is a physical system, like I said, but that means it's also located in physical places. And because of where the infrastructure is, especially a lot of it's in sort of Virginia and Ohio, that means that it uses the energy sources that are most common in those places, and that's often coal. In Ohio, they use about 60% coal. In Virginia, mainly natural gas, but also a good amount. And so I think, while watching Netflix doesn't make you an industrial polluter, it connects you to a system that is, burning coal. And so I think it's a really powerful way to explore and illustrate that, we are all in this together. Even if your state has different energy policies or you have solar panels on your roof, you're connected to this fossil fuel system that may pollute the air and water of somebody who lives nearby one of the facilities that powers the internet. And so that I thought was a really great example of what I was trying to do in the book, which is to show that the consequences of our consumption aren't kind of limited to us. They connect all of us to each other and to people around the planet, and to the kind of crisis of climate change.
And you talk about those of us who live in more affluent communities are also protected. Maybe you can talk about the environmental disaster related to coal ash that happened a few years ago that many of us haven't heard of.
Yeah, sure. So, coal ash is the byproduct of burning coal for electricity. I think often when we hear about coal, we think mainly about the greenhouse gas emissions or the coal mining, but it creates this dust that contains lead, mercury, arsenic, cadmium, selenium, sort of all the heavy metal alphabet soup. And it's usually stored in water, so in dammed off sections of rivers and lakes or landfills next to coal-fired power plants. It causes cancer, lung disease, kidney disease for people who are exposed. It often, gets into drinking water of people who live nearby. Or if it's in a landfill, the dust can, be inhaled by people who live nearby. Before I became a climate change and environmental journalist, I had never heard of coal ash pollution, and that's a luxury that millions of Americans, the majority of whom are Black or members of communities of color or low-income communities, they don't have that luxury. They live with this problem every day. In 2008, one of the largest environmental disasters in American history happened in Tennessee, where a dam holding back coal ash broke and spilled millions of gallons into a river in Tennessee, buried 300 acres of land in sludge. The river bottom was coated in this material. When it was cleaned up, most of the coal ash was carted away to an unlined landfill outside a predominantly Black community in Alabama. The workers who sued, that it was a violation of their civil rights and a massive example of environmental injustice. The workers who came to clean up the spill were not given protective equipment. Dozens of them have died. Hundreds of them have been made sick. They've recently won a lawsuit in Tennessee, more than 10 years later. So, and again, it was something that I never had to think about. And living in New York City, not living near a coal plant, I don't ever have to think about it. But I think now that I know about it, I try to talk about it everywhere I go, because I think it's so powerful of an example of how willing we are to turn a blind eye to the injustices around us. And I think that, a country in which certain people are, exposed to toxic, hazardous pollution because of their race, their income, where they live, is a country that's less free and less just for all of us. And we are learning that every day in many, many different ways. But I think a country or a world that doesn't burn fossil fuels also doesn't, make people sick in unjust ways. And so this is, I think, in many ways, an enormous opportunity to do things differently, is to stop burning fossil fuels. So, but that, in my book, I connect that to the problem of the internet, because if the internet is powered by coal, it's producing coal ash, and that's affecting someone else's air and water. And so I think it's always important to try to keep these connections in mind.
Going back to the theme of try to empower our viewers. So you talk some about how big tech is not being very transparent about their global footprint. So what is it that we as consumers, or how do you see that structural problem changing, where we can require them to be more transparent, and so that some of these costs are less hidden?
Well, since the book came out, they're doing more to power their facilities renewably. That being said, if they have if it's not windy or sunny, they're going to be relying on some kind of backup electricity. And depending on where it is, it's going to be from fossil fuels. I think some people may have heard last year that Jeff Bezos announced his climate pledge, of $10 billion towards solving climate change. I think that's great, but he also has built a business that's premised on infinite growth of and shopping. And all of us use the internet. Many of us probably use Amazon. We don't necessarily have to, but also we have a lot of power as consumers. I know that it doesn't often feel that way, but I think, there were Amazon workers who went on strike to protest the company's stance on climate change, and the company changed a lot of what it was doing. So I think it's important to call this out, to support those workers, to buy less. It's really hard because, I know that people don't, that, we aren't necessarily in control, and we feel like, I am at home and now I have to be on Zoom, or, whatever, I can't do anything else. So I get that it's hard, and that we kind of feel trapped in the system, but I think it's also important to remember that we do have power and we do have choice. But I know that can feel difficult.
But another compliment I'd like to make about the book, and again, I encourage viewers to read it, is you're very fair. Like, you don't immediately, you take an objective view at online shopping, and you actually say there are some benefits. Maybe you could just give the example of, if individuals drive to store versus having something delivered to your home, but then what it is that we do that messes that system up.
Yeah, sure. So that was actually, I wanted to write about online shopping and e-commerce because I felt like I had heard the same thing for so long, which was like, well, it has to be bad because of all this cardboard in my house and all that plastic packaging, and which is some of which is true, but a lot of the cardboard stuff is really just displacement. Like, now the cardboard comes to us instead of going to the store. So actually, I found that, over the last 10 years, the amount of cardboard in the US has stayed relatively flat. However, we are much worse at recycling cardboard than retailers. So consumer recycling of cardboard, I think, tops out at around 25%, whereas retailers will recycle between 95 and 100%. And then there's what Tom was referring to, which is logistics companies that do deliveries, are very efficient in planning their routes. And much more efficient than if I'm driving to the store to buy something. So it can actually be more efficient to order things online. The problem is that when we order next day or 2-day shipping, or I guess you can get things now in an hour, we kind of force the delivery truck to go out half empty or half full, depending on how you look at it. But so that it, makes a less efficient route, because I've decided that I need my, I don't know, dog food in a precise 2-hour window instead of waiting a couple more days in order to get it. And so we kind of screw with the efficiency savings that way. We also, when we buy online, we return more. So I think there's something like people return between 6 and 15% of what they buy in a store, but we return 35% of what we buy online, which could cause another trip. Or we send something back to the store, we assume it ends up back in this, carousel of buying and selling, but actually just ends up being thrown away, landfilled, or burned a lot of the time. And so it can be much more wasteful in those ways. But it was an interesting exercise. And of course, there are many downsides to having more trucks on the road rather than cars, because trucks cause more pollution. They burn a dirtier fuel. That pollution also from trucks, from highways, from cars disproportionately affects again, low-income communities and communities of color who are more likely to live next to a major road. So there are all different kinds of considerations, but it was interesting for me to kind of dig into that efficiency and wastefulness aspect of it.
Great, we're going to run out of time, so I'll just hit upon a couple of things in the other chapters. So let's turn to food, and here you write a lot about corn, and you emphasize that again, much of the corn is grown, or much of the calorie producing food that's grown is grown for livestock and not to feed people. Just tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Michael Pollan, as probably do most of us, for what we know about corn. But yeah, I mean, about more than 2/3 of crop calories in the US don't feed people. They feed animals, and it's used for fuel. And so when we think about how much energy and land and water is used for all of that, it's no wonder that our food system doesn't make any sense. But it also is, having corn in a lot of our food is not healthy for us either, and has all kinds of adverse consequences for our health and things like that. But I was also concerned, or was interested to learn about, especially something like fertilizer use, which is extraordinarily heavy on corn, and what that does for water pollution. That can, it's responsible for toxic algae in Lake Erie, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and around the world, kind of dead zones at the mouths of every major river. And so, it's an argument to reduce not only corn, but just sort of industrialized agriculture as a whole. But again, in the book, I'm not a proselytizer for organic food, because some studies show that if only about 1% of global food is grown organically. So to feed the world organically, because organic food has a lower yield, we'd have to clear cut many of the world's forests and wetlands in order to do that. And so I think we really need a balance of some of the advantages of industrialized agriculture, but also, recognizing that a system that depletes the health of soil and destroys water is not kind of productive in the long run.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the sections on food. And again, I wish I had more questions, but I think I'll keep us moving.
I'm talking too much, so it's my fault.
No, it's perfect. No, don't worry about that at all. Just the time runs so quickly. But I mean, it is one area where you do recommend that one thing individuals can do in their personal lives that to make a big difference is to shift their protein source, even just for 1 or 2 nights, away from animal products. Can you just talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I think in food, a lot of the things that we've heard are true, which is like red meat is not great for the planet. And that's for some of those reasons related to fertilizer, but also, just the kind of methane and greenhouse gas emissions associated with animal production. And one statistic that was really interesting was, I think probably many of us heard, like, we should be eating all local. And that's good in many ways, because it means that you're supporting local farmers who likely are not participating in these kind of big industrialized systems. But in order to really have that make a meaningful difference on the carbon footprint of your diet, you have to be really, really good at it. And you could be, as Tom suggests, much more efficient just by, not having meat, or having meat 1 day fewer a week. So it really, it does make a difference if that's something that you are interested in doing.
So I have to admit, I didn't even know what fast fashion was until I read your book.
Shocked.
So maybe there are some other viewers. Explain what fast fashion is and why it's a bad thing, and then I'll ask you maybe about cotton and about denim.
Sure. So fast fashion, I guess, is I don't know if there's like a simple definition, but it's this sort of very kind of cheaply mass produced, largely synthetic clothing that kind of mimics sort of runway styles and is, trendy. Companies like H&M or Zara, people might be familiar with. I wrote about fast fashion because, for a lot of reasons, but one of them being just the kind of amount of waste that it encourages. A lot of the clothing is produced incredibly cheaply. And I think, if we're thinking about why things don't cost a lot of money, it's usually because no one's paying for the ultimate cost of producing them. So with something like clothing, it's, the greenhouse gas, the chemical pollution, the water pollution, the labor, of course, and I can't remember, I'm forgetting some of the statistics, but the average item of clothing is worn like 7 times before it's thrown away. And a lot of that has to do with something like with these kind of fast fashion companies. And part of that is because it's very on trend, but part of that is also just because the stuff is not well made.
And talk a little bit about denim and the amount of water that we're shocked to learn.
I wanted to write about cotton, and a way to do that was to write about denim, because especially for an American audience, I think it's a very evocative thing. But yeah, it takes on average, I think around 2,000 gallons of water to grow about 2 pounds of cotton. It can take as much as an additional about 3,000 gallons of water to turn that cotton into a pair of blue jeans. So it's incredibly water intensive, of course, but also growing cotton uses a lot of pesticides and things like that. But cotton is often grown in water stressed parts of the world to begin with. The drying up of the Aral Sea in Central Asia can largely be attributed to cotton production. We see kind of depletion of aquifers in Texas and other parts of the world as a response, in response to growing cotton and denim, just with dyeing denim and making it look aged or different colors and all these things, has just an additional huge water use. So there are some companies that are trying to do better, and we'll kind of advertise that. But it was stunning to me to learn about all of that. And I think, to me, I felt like, well, if I'm standing in a store, it's almost impossible for me to figure out which pair of jeans uses less water. But someone does know that, and that should, they should try not to use less water, but also that should be communicated to us as consumers, so that it's possible to make a choice that supports a better practice.
Yeah, when I read that section, I thought of, we do now have these calorie counters even in wherever you go, and you can make a decision about, do I want that or that? And it's very quick and easy. And that goes back again to your central point, that as consumers and as voters, we can have regulations that would do that for us. We don't really have time, but I was also fascinated when talking about synthetic fabrics and microfibers, and this one factoid from your book, that a single fleece coat can shed 100,000 plastic microfibers in one washing. So it's not necessarily a solution there either to move away from cotton necessarily.
Yeah, it was interesting because a company like Patagonia kind of developed fleece as a way to figure out what to do with plastic bottles, and then it's kind of created this whole other subset of microfiber plastic pollution. And some scientists think that microfiber plastic pollution, not just from fleeces but from synthetic clothing and other textiles, is one of the most, if not the most abundant source of pollution on the planet. And I just saw a study last week that people are finding it just swirling around in air, which is horrifying. So I think we're, a lot of our kind of blithe acceptance of the fleeces we wanted or whatever else it is kind of catching up with us.
Again, we're running out of time. We've got some good questions from the audience. So rather than talking about kind of the problem of fuel, which is your last chapter, maybe you could just talk, because I think people sometimes don't understand what a carbon tax is or what it could mean, and why increasing fuel efficiency standards, what those things can make such a huge difference.
That's a good question. So yeah, I think people often are, confused or have questions about who a carbon tax would hurt and who it would benefit, and that that some of the costs for more efficient goods shouldn't be passed to the consumer, and I think that's fair. But typically it's a fair question, and it's a good one, but typically they're not. So with the way that a carbon tax usually works, or is not usually because it doesn't exist, but if it did exist, polluters would have to pay for the amount of greenhouse gases or the carbon dioxide equivalent if they emit a different kind of greenhouse gas of whatever it is that they produce. And depending on kind of the exact mechanism, that tax could be redistributed to people, could pay for financing electric cars or cleaner infrastructure, whatever else it is. So there would be an incentive for companies to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases that they emitted, and to switch to different fuel sources and also to be more efficient in what they emit. And so that's sort of what I think that was regarded as a transformational idea not that long ago, and people are now saying that it's not enough. But I think it could be a place to start, just to accelerate the shift from industry and from the electricity and transportation sectors, which are among the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases.
In that section or some of your interviews, I heard you say that you want to be the kind of person who lives in line with your values. And could you just explain that sometimes when you fly in an airplane, you try to neutralize your own carbon footprint by purchasing a carbon offset? That was a new concept to me. Can you explain how that works?
Sure. And carbon offsets are not perfect. And I think it's hard for me, having learned everything I've learned, to just exist in the world. But as Tom said, I do try to live in line with my values and to be the kind of person who learns this information and acts on it. So a carbon offset is, a way to compensate in some way to, take up the carbon dioxide that whatever activity you've done has emitted. So often that has been, historically, it's usually something like planting trees, which use carbon dioxide to grow, or more renewable energy. It can also be things like carbon sequestration, or carbon capture and storage, which is a kind of new and emerging technology. Again, they're not perfect, and there's a lot of, if they're not permanent, if the forest is cut down the next year, it doesn't really do a lot. But there are, some companies that do better than others. I think, something that's incredibly important and a hugely powerful carbon sink are wetlands and wetland restoration. So, there are reasons to support those kinds of projects, whether or not you're flying, but it can just be an easy way to try to do, make up for some of the damage we're doing.
I'm going to go to questions, but I had a kind of interesting thing. I was reading your book this weekend. I think it was a New York Review of Books, and it was an interview with a fellow New York Times journalist, or former one, Howard French. And in your acknowledgments, you pay tribute to your husband because he's a doctor, and you say he's there saving lives every day. But Howard French wrote that he was introduced to international reporting because his father was a doctor whose original specialty was pediatric heart surgery, but his father decided in mid-career to go back to school to study public health because he felt that by getting involved in community-based preventative health care, in his father's case, primarily in Africa, that he and other medical workers could save or improve the lives of large numbers of people rather than just treating individuals one at a time. Anyway, so before taking questions from the audience, I wanted to acknowledge the same, that I feel like your journalism in this book in particular is helping not only to save lives, but our planet and our children and our grandchildren's lives. So we pay tribute to this work that you've done. Thank you for it.
That's so nice. And I don't know how to respond other than that I hope to live to deserve the compliment.
So the first question that came through, I thought was the easiest one. Someone wanted to know the name again of the paradox that you mentioned in the context of energy consumption.
It's Jevons, Jevons. I think it's typically related to energy savings. It's also called the rebound effect. It's not only related to, I think, energy efficiency, but that's often how it's used, especially with regards to energy efficiency and things like that.
Great. This person says it seems like a tremendous amount of research went into the book, and the viewer is wondering how long it took you to write it.
I wrote the book in a year. it was, kind of building on some ideas that I had, when I was working at the New York Times, but I wrote and researched this book in a year.
This is a pretty big question. Can you touch upon international efforts, as well as efforts that the US government needs to undertake?
With international efforts, or what the
Yeah,
US?
I think international efforts. Or
Yeah.
maybe just give one that you think we should pay attention to.
Sure. I think that, then there was an article to this effect in the New York Times yesterday about how, the US has lost a lot of credibility over the last 4 years, given that the Trump administration pulled out of the Paris Agreement and sort of undid much of the progress that had been made in the Obama administration. So it will be a challenge for the United States to rebuild its credibility. And I think it seems like John Kerry is doing everything he possibly can to do that, including there's a international summit of leaders tomorrow that President Biden is convening. And so I think restoring trust is important, and the best way to do that is to get to work, which is not easy. But again, there was another New York Times article yesterday, a profile of Gina McCarthy and how hard she's working. Sometimes I mention politicians who aren't from Massachusetts, but I feel like today, I've only, except for AOC, it's just been very
a good hometown girl. She even has a nice Boston accent.
Yeah.
Is the standard for truck emissions less stringent than that for cars?
So trucks use diesel fuel typically, which is just dirtier than what cars use. And that's just because their engines are bigger and heavier. I'm not sure. The standards are lower. I'm not sure exactly what they are. There's also, I write about this in the book, these things called glider engines, which the Obama administration tried to kind of put a cap on and get rid of. But basically these people were taking really old truck engines and putting them in new trucks, and then they were just way less efficient than even kind of newer trucks. But yes, the standards are different, but I'm not sure exactly what kind of the mileage requirements are.
So this viewer wants to know, since cotton is not a good choice for clothing or pants, is there a more environmentally friendly material to purchase when one's purchasing his or her clothes?
It's really hard because everything, has an impact. I think typically natural fibers are better. They do kind of have that water impact, but synthetic fibers also use a ton of water to be produced, and significant greenhouse gas emissions. And in synthetic fibers, I should say, because sometimes people don't realize or forget, are made from fossil fuels. I think the best thing to do is to buy fewer things and to wear them longer. That's kind of what most of the experts who I spoke to said, or buy secondhand. There are a lot of companies now that rent clothes, and that's a kind of more sustainable option as well. But yeah, it's really hard to find acceptable alternatives. So I think for me, I've tried to focus on just buying fewer things and wearing them out. But it's tough.
So I admitted earlier that I have no idea what fast fashion was. But it's interesting. I did notice over the last couple of years around the holiday times that cashmere was cheaper, and I bought my wife a couple of cashmere sweaters because she likes to use them when she's a college professor, and she likes, they keep her warm, but they're lighter. But then reading your book, I find that I'm, again, as kind of the theme of your book, part of this global system that I wasn't aware of, and there's a reason why cashmere is cheaper, and it's not a good story. Maybe you can just recount that briefly.
Yeah, it's kind of an amazing story. And I was speaking with a former scientist at the NRDC and sort of asking her what to write about, and she was like, "Well, you have to write about cashmere," and I didn't really know why, but I quickly found out. So basically, cashmere, as people might know is made from the like fine hair of a certain kind of goat that mainly lives in Mongolia and China. And these goats have very sharp hooves. If you read anything about them, you will see them described as stiletto. They break up the soil with their hooves, which allows it to blow around more easily. They also, when they graze, they eat the grass, by its roots, so that further destabilizes the soil. In addition to that, it is difficult to get a precise estimate of the goat population of Mongolia, though I did try. In 1990, I think it was, around 4 million goats. By 2004, it was 26 million goats. So there's just a huge increase in the population, which is why the cashmere is cheaper. But having that many goats with those effects really has destabilized the kind of top layer of soil of this part of the world, which is already experiencing climate change at a much faster rate than much of the rest of the world. So if the average surface temperature of the Earth has warmed by 1 degree Fahrenheit in Mongolia, I think it's 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's much drier and hotter. The soil is destabilized. So, desertification is a natural process that happens, but it's now happening much faster. So, an additional 1,500 square miles of desert is added to this region of the world every year. So that's like a Rhode Island, to put it in terms we'll all understand. So then that dust that's now being blown to create more desert also travels farther east, where it combines with the pollution from many of the factories in Beijing and other parts of China, and adds to the air pollution there. In another 5 days, particularly in the spring, that pollution travels across the Pacific Ocean and comes to California. So it's a kind of tremendous environmental storm, I guess, for lack of a better term. But officials in California say that I think 40% of the air pollution there can be attributed to dust from Chinese factories and increasingly from the desert. And so it's just a kind of amazing, again, like this encapsulation, similar to the coal ash and the internet, of how, our consumption of what we think of as just our scarf or sweater is really connected to these kind of major polluting events, in other parts of the world. And I think there's often a lot of blame on China. It's like, well, how do we have any chance of fighting climate change if China is doing all this bad stuff? But it's connected to what we do and what we want. And I think we need to have a kind of honest accounting of where the impacts are from a lot of the stuff that we're buying, not to make Tom feel too guilty about his Christmas presents.
I'll be more careful in future years. This questioner asks, since you're suggesting this needs to be a societal change, are there societies or countries who are leading the effort that the U.S. might, want to follow their lead?
Well, most societies are, we have, the kind of biggest per capita carbon footprint of any country. So anyone, many other countries would be better. But I think there's, I have kind of guesses of why things are the way that they are, but I think in, certain European countries or Japan, if we are comparing to the developed world, which I think is more as a fair comparison, I don't know if they're kind of resource constraints based on like the history of the Second World War and how people kind of thought about reusing things and stuff like that. But, people are much recycling and not driving and kind of doing something take for granted. I think you pretty quickly that it's harder to kind of make these changes than a lot of things. The EU has we're meant to get, their electricity from renewable, and some of that is things like burning biomass, which you can read in the book is not necessarily a great solution. So it varies, and everyone can do better, but everyone seems to be getting more ambitious. So, not everyone, but a lot of countries are.
I'm going to paraphrase this next question, but I think it's suggesting again, you talk about individuals and low-income individuals or people living in low-income communities who face more of the consequences. But I think this person's suggesting that some of, not so much the collective action you're talking about voting, but some of the personal actions require people to have more income.
Yeah.
So how does an individual living in a low-income community kind of confront these challenges, given their that they have fewer resources?
Yeah, question, and I think that's why in general in climate policy you hear a lot on things like a just transition, but also it shouldn't be the consumer's responsibility to solve this problem, and it especially should not fall to low income communities to make sure that they have a good carbon footprint, or whatever it is. It should be on the companies to do a better job. And I think government regulation can really help with that. For example, a great example is the regulation we had about energy efficient light bulbs. So if there's a law that says that you have to make light bulbs more efficient by X date, all of the companies have to do that. It's not on the consumer to make the choice of which light bulb to buy, and kind of sacrificing the long-term efficiency and the climate solution for a cheaper incandescent bulb. All of the light bulbs will reflect whatever the law says, and that those costs long-term, most of the stuff is actually cheaper in the long term for people. I understand that upfront costs can be challenging, but I think it is on government and it is on corporation to reduce the burden, because it is not fair, as the viewer suggests, to force consumers, especially those who cannot afford and don't have necessarily the kind of access to information and resources to make their responsible choice. And so, my point is that we need to shift responsibility away from the consumer. And I understand there's concerns about those costs being passed to the consumer, but I would hope that we can move to a society where there's a range of options and all of them are sustainable.
Great. I prepared just a couple of sentences here, Tatiana, to end, and then I'll turn it over to you to have a last comment, and then we'll say goodnight to our audience. So I would happen to be listening to a weekly program on a community radio station. I was in Maine this weekend, and it's part Farmer's Almanac, part kind of Sunday sermon, but he's a retired minister, and he closed his remarks by stating, quote, "To the extent that we cause the problems we face today, we can cure them. We are the caretakers of the planet. If we care for it, it will care for us." And that reminded me, before I came to Concord, I made a living actually of finding the right quotes from your grandfather appropriate to forums like this. So this is from President Kennedy's speech at American University in June of 1963. He warned his fellow citizens not to succumb to what he called, quote, "dangerous defeatist beliefs that lead us to conclude that mankind is doomed, that we are gripped by forces we cannot control. Our problems," he noted, "are man-made, and therefore they can be solved by man. Man's reason and spirit have often solved the unseemingly unsolvable, and we believe they can do it again." And finally, he went on to redefine how we think about human rights, and he called it, including the right to live out our lives without fear of devastation, the right to breathe air as nature provided it, and the right of future generations to a healthy existence. So let me close now with eloquent words of President Kennedy's granddaughter and one of his contemporaries. Tatiana concludes her book by stating, quote, "There's no corner of the earth that our actions don't affect. Our indifference to the value of our resources and to their limits threatens everything, including our own success and survival." And lastly, I'll end with these words of James Baldwin: "There's never a time in the future in which we will work out our salvation. The challenge is in the moment. The time is always now." So Tatiana, thank you for challenging us with your new book, for taking the time to spend this moment with us. It's been informative, inspirational, and if we're to find salvation, it will surely be on the backs of thoughtful activists and journalists like you. So I'll leave the last word to you, and then I'll say goodnight to our viewers.
Well, it's hard to ever want to follow my grandfather or James Baldwin. So I feel like I probably should leave it at that. But I actually have a quote that I think is not by me, but that I've found a lot of meaning in recently, which is from a book called Fathoms, which is about the Fathoms, the World in a Whale, which is about whales by the Australian journalist Rebecca Giggs. Being hopeful follows from being useful. This has been my experience. And to be useful, it matters that you identify a part of the problem that you might see change in, using the talents and the resources that you possess. Hope is fellowship. Hope is in the doing. We may be the only species capable of imagining a future robbed of the wonder of encountering other species. This knowledge, in the end, gives us cause to start.
Lovely note. Tatiana Schlossberg, thank you so much for joining us tonight.